The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 3, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 8, Side 2. Toward 1150, one of Abelard's pupils, Peter Lombard, published a book which was at once a compilation of Abelard's thought, purified of heresy, and a beginning of the formal scholastic philosophy. Peter, like Anselm, Arnold of Brescia, Bonaventure, and Thomas Aquinas, was an Italian who came to France for advanced work in theology and philosophy. He liked Abelard, and called the Sic et Non his breviary. But also he wanted to be a bishop. His Sententiarum Libri Quattro, or 4 books of opinions, applied and chastened the method of the Sic et Non. He drew up under each question of theology an array of biblical and patristic quotations for and against. But this Peter labored conscientiously to resolve all contradictions into orthodox conclusions. He was made Bishop of Paris, and his book became, for 4 centuries, so favorite a text in theological courses that Roger Bacon reproved it for having displaced the Bible itself. More than 4,000 theologians, including Albert and Thomas, are said to have written commentaries on the sentences. As Lombard's book upheld the authority of the Scriptures and the Church against the claims of the individual reason, it stayed for half a century the advance of rationalism. But in that half-century, a strange event transformed theology. As the translation of Aristotle's scientific and metaphysical works into Arabic had in the 9th century compelled Moslem thinkers to seek a reconciliation between Islamic doctrine and Greek philosophy, and as the impingement of Aristotle upon the Hebrew mind in Spain was in this 12th century driving Ibn Daud and Maimonides to seek a harmony between Judaism and Hellenic thought, so the arrival of Aristotle's works in Latin dress in the Europe of 1150 to 1250 impelled Catholic theologians to attempt a synthesis of Greek metaphysics and Christian theology. And as Aristotle seemed immune to scriptural authority, the theologians were forced to use the language and weapons of reason. How the Greek philosopher would have smiled to see so many world-shaking faiths pay homage to his thought. But we must not exaggerate the influence of Greek thinkers in stimulating the efflorescence of philosophy in this period. The spread of education, the vitality of discussion and intellectual life in the schools and universities of the 12th century, the stimulus of such men as Rosselin, William of Champeaux, Abelard, William of Conches, and John of Salisbury, the enlargement of horizons by the Crusades, the increasing acquaintance with Islamic life and thought in East and West, all these could have produced an Aquinas even if Aristotle had remained unknown. Indeed, the industry of Aquinas was due not to love of Aristotle, but to fear of Averroes. Already in the 12th century, the Arabic and Jewish philosophers were influencing Christian thought in Spain. Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, Avicenna, Ibn Gabirol, Averroes, and Maimonides entered Latin Europe by the same doors that admitted Plato and Aristotle, Hippocrates and Galen, Euclid and Ptolemy. Such an invasion by alien thought was a mental shock of the first order to the immature West. We need not wonder that it was met at first with an attempt at repression or delay. We must marvel rather at the astonishing feat of adaptation by which the old new knowledge was absorbed into the new faith. The initial impact of Aristotle's physics and metaphysics, and of Averroes's commentaries, which reached Paris in the first decade of the 13th century, shook the orthodoxy of many students, and some scholars, like Amalric of Bennes and David of Dinan, were moved to attack such basic doctrines of Christianity as creation, miracles, and personal immortality. The Church suspected that the seeping of Arabic Greek thought into South France had loosened orthodoxy among the educated classes, and had weakened their will to control the Albigensian heresy. In 1210, a church council at Paris condemned Amalric and David, and forbade the reading of Aristotle's Metaphysics and Natural Philosophy, or of comments, or commentaries thereon. As the prohibition was repeated by a papal legate in 1215, we may assume that the decree of 1210 had stimulated the reading of these otherwise forbidding books. The Fourth Council of the Lateran allowed the teaching of Aristotle's works on logic and ethics, but proscribed the rest. In 1231, Gregory IX gave absolution to masters and scholars who had disobeyed these edicts, but he renewed the edicts provisionally until the books of the philosopher had been examined and expurgated. The 3 Parisian masters appointed to attend to this fumigation of Aristotle seem to have abandoned the task. The prohibitions were not long enforced, for in 1255 the Physics, Metaphysics, and other works of Aristotle were required reading at the University of Paris. In 1263 Urban IV restored the prohibitions, but apparently Thomas Aquinas assured him that Aristotle could be sterilized, and Urban did not press his vetoes. In 1366, the legates of Urban V at Paris required a thorough study of the works of Aristotle by all candidates for the arts degree. The dilemma presented to Latin Christendom in the first quarter of the 13th century constituted a major crisis in the history of the faith. The rage for the new philosophy was an intellectual fever that could hardly be controlled. The Church abandoned the effort. Instead, she deployed her forces to surround and absorb the invaders. Her loyal monks studied this amazing Greek who had upset 3 religions. The Franciscans, though they preferred Augustine to Aristotle, welcomed Alexander of Hales, who made the first attempt to harmonize the philosopher with Christianity. The Dominicans gave every encouragement to Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas in the same enterprise. And when these 3 men had finished their work, it seemed that Aristotle had been made safe for Christianity. 3. The Freethinkers. To understand scholasticism as no vain accumulation of dull abstractions, we must see the 13th century not as the unchallenged field of the great scholastics, but as a battleground on which, for 70 years, skeptics, materialists, pantheists, and atheists contested with the theologians of the Church for possession of the European mind. We have noted the presence of unbelief in a small minority of the European population. Contact with Islam through the Crusades and the translations extended this minority in the 13th century. The discovery that another great religion existed and had produced fine men like Saladin and Al-Kamil, philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes, was in itself a disturbing revelation. Comparative religion does religion no good. Alfonso the Wise, from 1252 to 1284, reported a common disbelief in immortality among the Christians of Spain. Perhaps Averroism had trickled down to the people. In southern France there were in the 13th century rationalists who argued that God, after creating the world, had left its operation to natural law. Miracles, they held, were impossible. No prayer could change the behavior of the elements, and the origin of new species was due not to special creation but to natural development. At Paris, some freethinkers, even some priests, denied transubstantiation, and at Oxford, a teacher complained that there is no idolatry like that of the sacrament of the altar. Alain of Lille, from 1114 to 1203, remarks that many false Christians of our time say there is no resurrection, since the soul perishes with the body. They quoted Epicurus and Lucretius, adopted atomism, and concluded that the best thing to do is enjoy life here on earth. The urban industrialism of Flanders seems to have promoted unbelief. At the beginning of the 13th century, we find David of Dinan, and near its end, Sige of Brabant, leading a strongly skeptical movement. David, circa 1200, taught philosophy at Paris and entertained Innocent III with his subtle disputations. He played with a materialistic pantheism in which God, mind, and pure matter, matter before receiving form, all became one in a new trinity. His book, Quater Nulli, now lost, was condemned and burned by the Council of Paris in 1210. The same synod denounced the pantheism of another Parisian professor, Amalric of Benne, who had argued that God and the creation are one. Amalric was compelled to retract and died, we are told, of mortification in 1207. The council had his bones exhumed and burned them in a Paris square as a hint to his many followers. They persisted nevertheless, and enlarged his views to a denial of heaven and hell and the power of the sacraments. 10 of these Amoricians were burned at the stake in 1210. Free thought flourished in the southern Italy of Frederick II, where St. Thomas grew up. Cardinal Ubaldini, friend of Frederick, openly professed materialism. In northern Italy, the industrial workers, the business classes, the lawyers, and the professors indulged in a measure of skepticism. The Bolognese faculty was notoriously indifferent to religion. The medical schools there and elsewhere were centers of doubt. And an adage arose that ubi tres medici, duo atei. Where there are 3 physicians, 2 of them are atheists. About 1240, Averroism became almost a fashion among the educated laity of Italy. Thousands accepted the Averroistic doctrines that natural law rules the world without any interference by God, that the world is co-eternal with God, that there is only one immortal soul, the active intellect of the cosmos, of which the individual soul is a transitory phase or form, and that heaven and hell are tales invented to coax or terrify the populace into decency. To appease the Inquisition, some Averroists advanced the doctrine of twofold truth. A proposition, they argued, might seem true in philosophy or according to natural reason, and yet be false according to Scripture and the Christian faith. They professed at the same time to believe according to faith what they doubted according to reason. Such a theory denied the basic assumption of scholasticism, the possibility of reconciling reason and faith. Towards the end of the 13th and throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, the University of Padua was a turbulent center of Averroism. Peter of Urbano, circa 1250 to 1316, professor of medicine at Paris and then of philosophy at Padua, wrote in 1303 a book, Conciliator Controversiarum, designed to harmonize medical and philosophical theory. He earned a place in the history of science by teaching that the brain is the source of the nerves and the heart of the vessels, and by measuring the year with remarkable accuracy as 365 days, 6 hours, and 4 minutes. Convinced of astrology, he reduced almost all causation to the power and movement of the stars, and practically eliminated God from the government of the world. Inquisitors accused him of heresy, but Marquis Azzo d'Este and Pope Honorius IV were among his patients and protected him. He was accused again in 1315, and this time escaped trial by dying a natural death. The inquisitors condemned his corpse to be burned at the stake, but his friends so well concealed his remains that the judgment had to be executed in effigy. When Thomas Aquinas went from Italy to Paris, he discovered that Averroism had long since captured a part of the faculty. In 1240, William of Auvergne noted that many men at the university swallow these Averroistic conclusions without investigation. And in 1252, Thomas found Averroism flourishing among the university youth. Perhaps alarmed by Thomas's report, Pope Alexander IV in 1256 charged Albertus Magnus to write a treatise on the unity of the intellect against Averroes. When Thomas taught at Paris, from 1252 to 1261, and from 1269 to 1272, the Averroistic movement was at its height. Its leader in France, Siger of Brabant, taught in the university from 1266 to 1276. For a generation, Averroism and Catholicism made Paris their battlefield. Siger, possibly from 1235 to 1281, a secular priest, was a man of learning. Even the surviving fragments of his works quote Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Al-Ghazali, Avicenna, Avampesi, Avicebron, Averroes, and Maimonides. In a series of commentaries on Aristotle, and in a controversial tract against those famous men in philosophy, Albert and Thomas, Siger argued that Albert and Thomas falsely, Averroes justly, interpreted the philosopher. He concluded with Averroes that the world is eternal, that natural law is invariable, and that only the soul of the species survives the individual's death. God, said Siger, is the final, not the efficient cause of things. He is the goal, not the cause of creation. Led like Pico and Nietzsche by the fascination of logic, Siger played with the dismal doctrine of eternal recurrence. Since, he argued, all earthly events are ultimately determined by stellar combinations, and the number of these possible combinations is finite, each combination must be exactly repeated again and again in an infinity of time, and must bring in its train the same effects as before. The same species will return, the same opinions, laws, religions. Siger was careful to add, "We say this according to the opinion of the philosopher, but without affirming that it is true." To all his heresies he appended a similar caution. He did not profess the doctrine of two truths. He taught certain conclusions as, in his judgment, following from Aristotle and reason. When these conclusions contradicted the Christian creed, he affirmed his belief in the dogmas of the Church and applied only to them, not to philosophy, the label of truth. That Siger had a large following at the university is evident from his candidacy for the rectorship in 1271, though it failed. Nothing could better prove the strength of the Averroistic movement in Paris than its repeated denunciation by the Bishop of Paris, Etienne Tompier. In 1269 he condemned as heresies 13 propositions taught by certain professors in the university. That there is only one intellect in all men, that the world is eternal, that there never was a first man, that the soul is corrupted with the corruption of the body, that the will of man wills and chooses from necessity, that God does not know individual events, that human actions are not ruled by divine providence. Apparently the Averroists continued to teach as before, for in 1277 the bishop issued a list of 219 propositions, which he officially condemned as heresies. These, according to the bishop, were doctrines taught by Sige or Boethius of Dacia, or Roger Bacon, or other Parisian professors, including St. Thomas himself. The 219 included those condemned in 1269, and others, of which the following are examples. That creation is impossible, that a body once corrupted in death cannot rise again as the same body, that a future resurrection should not be believed by a philosopher, since it cannot be investigated by reason, that the words of theologians are founded on fables, that nothing is added to our knowledge by theology, that the Christian religion impedes learning, that happiness is obtained in this life, not in another, that the wise men of the earth are philosophers alone, that there is no more excellent condition than to have leisure for philosophy. In October 1277, Sige was condemned by the Inquisition. He passed his last years in Italy as a prisoner of the Roman Curia, and was murdered at Orvieto by a half-mad assassin. 4. The development of Scholasticism. To meet this frontal attack upon Christianity, it was not enough to condemn the heretical propositions. Youth had tasted the strong wine of philosophy. Could it be won back by reason? As the Mutakalimun had defended Mohammedanism from the Mutazilites, so now Franciscan and Dominican theologians, and secular prelates like William of Auvergne and Henry of Ghent, came to the defense of Christianity and the Church. The defense divided itself into two main camps, the mystic Platonic, mostly Franciscans, and the intellectual Aristotelian, mostly Dominicans. Benedictines like Hugh and Richard of St. Victor felt that the best defense of religion lay in man's direct consciousness of a spiritual reality deeper than all intellectual fathoming. Rigorists like Peter of Blois and Stephen of Tournai argued that philosophy should not discuss the problems of theology, or if it did, it should speak and behave as a modest servant of theology, ancilla theologiae. It should be noted that this view was held by only a sector of the scholastic front. A few Franciscans, like Alexander of Hales, possibly 1170 to 1245, adopted the intellectual approach and sought to defend Christianity in philosophical and Aristotelian terms. But most Franciscans distrusted philosophy. They felt that the adventure of reason, whatever strength and glory it might bring to the Church for a time, might later elude control and lead men so far from faith as to leave Christianity weak and helpless in an unbelieving and unmoral world. They preferred Plato to Aristotle, Bernard to Abélard, Augustine to Aquinas. They defined the soul, with Plato, as an independent spirit inhabiting and thwarted by the body, and they were shocked to hear Thomas accepting Aristotle's definition of the soul as the substantial form of the body. They found in Plato a theory of impersonal immortality, quite useless for checking the bestial impulses of men. Following Augustine, they ranked will above intellect in both God and man, and aimed at the good rather than the true. In their hierarchy of values, the mystic came closer than the philosopher to the secret essence and significance of life. This Platonic Augustinian division of the scholastic army dominated orthodox theology in the first half of the 13th century. Its ablest exponent was the saintly Bonaventure, a gentle spirit who persecuted heresy, a mystic writing philosophy, a scholar who deprecated learning, a lifelong friend and opponent of Thomas Aquinas, a defender and exemplar of evangelical poverty under whose ministry the Franciscan order made great gains in corporate wealth. Born in Tuscany in 1221, Giovanni di Fidanza came for some unknown reason to be called Bonaventura, good luck. He nearly died of a childhood malady. His mother prayed to St. Francis for his recovery. Giovanni thereafter felt that he owed his life to the saint. Entering the order, he was sent to Paris to study under Alexander of Hales. In 1248 he began to teach theology in the university. In 1257, still a youth of 36, he was chosen Minister General of the Franciscans. He did his best to reform the laxity of the order, but was too genial to succeed. He himself lived in ascetic simplicity. When messengers came to announce that he had been made a cardinal, they found him washing dishes. A year later, in 1274, he died of overwork. His books were well written, clear, and concise. He pretended to be a mere compiler, but he infused order, fervor, and a disarming modesty into every subject that he touched. His Breviloquium was an admirable summary of Christian theology. His Soliloquium and Itinerarium Mentis in Deum, Journey of the Mind to God, were jewels of mystic piety. True knowledge comes not through perception of the material world by the senses, but through intuition of the spiritual world by the soul. While loving St. Thomas, Bonaventura frowned upon the reading of philosophy and freely criticized some of Aquinas' conclusions. He reminded the Dominicans that Aristotle was a heathen, whose authority must not be ranked with that of the Fathers, and he asked, could the philosophy of Aristotle explain a moment's movements of a star? God is not a philosophical conclusion, but a living presence. It is better to feel him than to define him. The good is higher than the true, and simple virtue surpasses all the sciences. One day, we are told, Brother Egidio, overwhelmed by Bonaventura's learning, said to him, Alas, what shall we ignorant and simple ones do to merit the favor of God? My brother, replied Bonaventura, you know very well that it suffices to love the Lord. Do you then believe, asked Egidio, that a simple woman might please him as well as a master in theology? When the theologian answered in the affirmative, Egidio rushed into the street and cried out to a beggar woman, Rejoice, for if you love God, you may have a higher place in the kingdom of heaven than Brother Bonaventura. Obviously, it is a mistake to think of the scholastic philosophy as a dreary unanimity of opinion and approach. There were 100 scholastic philosophies. The same university faculty might harbor a Thomas honoring reason, a Bonaventura deprecating it, a William of Auvergne, 1180 to 1249, following Ibn Gabirol into voluntarism, a Sige teaching Averroism. The divergences and conflicts within orthodoxy were almost as intense as between faith and unbelief. A Franciscan bishop, John Peckham, would denounce Aquinas as sternly as Thomas denounced Sige and Averroes, and Albertus Magnus, in an unsaintly moment, wrote, There are ignorant men who would fight by every means the employment of philosophy, and particularly the Franciscans, brutish beasts who blaspheme that which they do not know. Albert loved knowledge and admired Aristotle this side of heresy. It was he who first among the scholastics surveyed all the major works of the philosopher and undertook to interpret them in Christian terms. He was born at Lauingen, Swabia, about 1201, son of the rich Count of Bollstedt. He studied at Padua, joined the Dominican order, and taught in Dominican schools at Hildesheim, Freiburg, Ratisbon, Strasbourg, Cologne, from 1228 to 1245, and Paris, from 1245 to 1248. Despite his preference for the scholastic life, he was made provincial of his order for Germany, and Bishop of Ratisbon in 1260. Tradition claims that he walked barefoot on all his journeys. In 1262, he was allowed to retire to a cloister at Cologne. He left its peace when he was 76 in 1277 to defend the doctrine and memory of his dead pupil Thomas Aquinas at Paris. He succeeded, returned to his monastery, and died at 79. His devoted life, unassuming character, and vast intellectual interests show medieval monasticism at its best. Only the quiet routine of his monastic years and the massive diligence of German scholarship can explain how a man who spent so much of his time in teaching and administration could write essays on almost every phase of science and substantial treatises on every branch of philosophy and theology. Few men in history have written so much, or borrowed so much, or so frankly acknowledged their debts. Albert bases his works almost title for title on Aristotle. He uses Averroes' commentaries to interpret the philosopher, but he corrects both of them manfully when they differ from Christian theology. He draws on the Moslem thinkers to such an extent that his works are an important source for our knowledge of Arabic philosophy. He cites Avicenna on every other page, and occasionally Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. He recognizes Aristotle as the highest authority in science and philosophy, Augustine in theology, the Scriptures in everything. His immense amount of discourse is poorly organized and never becomes a consistent system of thought. He defends a doctrine in one place, attacks it in another, sometimes in the same treatise. He had no time to resolve his contradictions. He was too good a man, too pious a soul, to be an objective thinker. He was capable of following a commentary on Aristotle with a long treatise in 12 books in praise of the Blessed Virgin Mary, in which he argued that Mary had a perfect knowledge of grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. What, then, was his achievement? Above all, as we shall see, he contributed substantially to the scientific research and theory of his time. In philosophy, he gave Aristotle to the Latins, which was all that he aimed to do. He promoted the use of Aristotle in the teaching of philosophy. He accumulated the storehouse of pagan, Arabic, Jewish, and Christian thought and argument, from which his famous pupil drew for a more lucid and orderly synthesis. Perhaps without Albert, Thomas would have been impossible. 5. Thomas Aquinas. Like Albert, Thomas came of lordly stock and gave up riches to win eternity. His father, Count Landulf of Aquino, belonged to the German nobility, was a nephew of Barbarossa, and was among the highest figures at the Apulian court of the impious Frederick II. His mother was descended from the Norman princes of Sicily. Though born in Italy, Thomas was on both sides of northern origin, essentially Teutonic. He had no Italian grace or deviltry in him, but grew to heavy German proportions, with large head, broad face, and blond hair, and a quiet content in intellectual industry. His friends called him the Great Dumb Ox of Sicily. He was born in 1225 in his father's castle at Roccasecca, 3 miles from Aquino, and halfway between Naples and Rome. The Abbey of Monte Cassino was nearby, and there Thomas received his early schooling. At 14 he began 5 years of study at the University of Naples. Michael Scott was there, translating Averroes into Latin. Jacob Anatoli was there, translating Averroes into Hebrew. Peter of Ireland, one of Thomas's teachers, was an enthusiastic Aristotelian. The university was a hotbed of Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew influences impinging upon Christian thought. Thomas's brothers took to poetry. One, Rinaldo, became a page and falconer at Frederick's court, and begged Thomas to join him there. Piero delle Vigne and Frederick himself seconded the invitation. Instead of accepting, Thomas entered the Dominican order in 1244. Soon thereafter he was sent to Paris to study theology. At the outset of his journey he was kidnapped by 2 of his brothers at their mother's urging. He was taken to the Roccasecca castle, and was kept under watch there for a year. Every means was used to shake his vocation. A story, probably a legend, tells how a pretty young woman was introduced into his chamber in the hope of seducing him back to life, and how with a flaming brand snatched from the hearth he drove her from the room and burned the sign of the cross into the door. His firm piety won his mother to his purposes. She helped him to escape, and his sister, Marota, after many talks with him, became a Benedictine nun. At Paris he had Albert the Great as one of his teachers in 1245. When Albert was transferred to Cologne, Thomas followed him, and continued to study with him there till 1252. At times Thomas seemed dull, but Albert defended him and prophesied his greatness. He returned to Paris to teach as a bachelor in theology, and now, following in his master's steps, he began a long series of works presenting Aristotle's philosophy in Christian dress. In 1259 he left Paris to teach at the Studium, maintained by the papal court now in Anagni, now in Orvieto, now in Viterbo. At the papal court he met William of Murbecca, and asked him to make Latin translations of Aristotle directly from the Greek. Meanwhile, Sige of Brabant was leading an Averroistic revolution at the University of Paris. Thomas was sent up to meet this challenge. Reaching Paris, he brought the war into the enemy's camp with a tract on the unity of the intellect against the Averroists of 1270. He concluded it with unusual fire. Behold our refutation of these errors. It is based not on documents of faith, but on the reasons and statements of the philosophers themselves. If then there be any who, boastfully taking pride in his supposed wisdom, wishes to challenge what we have written, let him not do it in some corner, nor before children who are powerless to decide on such difficult matters. Let him reply openly if he dare. He shall find me here confronting him, and not only my negligible self, but many another whose study is truth. We shall do battle with his errors, and bring a cure to his ignorance. It was a complex issue, for Thomas, in this his second period of teaching at Paris, had not only to combat Averroism, but also to meet the attacks of fellow monks who distrusted reason and who rejected Thomas's claim that Aristotle could be harmonized with Christianity. John Peckham, successor to Bonaventura in the Franciscan chair of philosophy at Paris, upbraided Thomas for sullying Christian theology with the philosophy of a pagan. Thomas, Peckham later reported, stood his ground but answered with great mildness and humility. Perhaps it was those 3 years of controversy that undermined his vitality. In 1272 he was called back to Italy at the request of Charles of Anjou to reorganize the University of Naples. In his final years he ceased writing, whether through weariness or through disillusionment with dialectics and argument. When a friend urged him to complete his Summa Theologica, he said, "I cannot. Such things have been revealed to me that what I have written seems but straw." In 1274, Gregory X summoned him to attend the Council of Lyons. He set out on the long mule ride through Italy, but on the way between Naples and Rome he grew weak and took to his bed in the Cistercian monastery of Fossa Nuova in the Campagna. There in 1274, still but 49, he died. When he was canonized, witnesses testified that he was soft-spoken, easy in conversation, cheerful and bland of countenance, generous in conduct, most patient, most prudent, radiant with charity and gentle piety, wondrous compassionate to the poor. He was so completely captured by piety and study that these filled every thought and moment of his waking day. He attended all the hours of prayer, said one Mass or heard 2 each morning, read and wrote, preached and taught, and prayed. Before a sermon or a lecture, before sitting down to study or compose, he prayed, and his fellow monks thought that he owed his knowledge less to the effort of the mind than to the virtue of his prayer. On the margin of his manuscripts we find every now and then pious invocations like Ave Maria. He became so absorbed in the religious and intellectual life that he hardly noticed what happened about him. In the refectory, his plate could be removed and replaced without his being aware of it, but apparently his appetite was excellent. Invited to join other clergymen at dinner with Louis IX, he lost himself in meditation during the meal. Suddenly he struck the table with his fist and exclaimed, "That is the decisive argument against the Manichaeans." His prior reproved him. "You are sitting at the table of the King of France." But Louis, with royal courtesy, bade an attendant bring writing materials to the victorious monk. Nevertheless, the absorbed saint could write with good sense on many matters of practical life. People remarked how he could adjust his sermons either to the studious minds of his fellow monks or to the simple intellects of common folk. He had no heirs, made no demands upon life, sought no honors, refused promotion to ecclesiastical office. His writings span the universe, but contain not one immodest word. He faces in them every argument against his faith, and answers with courtesy and calm. Improving upon the custom of his time, he made explicit acknowledgments of his intellectual borrowings. He quotes Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, Averroes, Isaac Israeli, Ibn Gabirol, and Maimonides. Obviously, no student can understand the scholastic philosophy of the 13th century without considering its Moslem and Jewish antecedents. Thomas does not share William of Auvergne's affection for Avicebron, but he has a high respect for Rabbi Moises, as he calls Moses ben Maimon. He follows Maimonides in holding that reason and religion can be harmonized, but also in placing certain mysteries of the faith beyond the grasp of reason, and he cites the argument for this exclusion as given in the Guide to the Perplexed. He agrees with Maimonides that the human intellect can prove God's existence, but can never rise to a knowledge of his attributes, and he follows Maimonides closely in discussing the eternity of the universe. In logic and metaphysics, he takes Aristotle as his guide, and quotes him on almost every page, but he does not hesitate to differ from him wherever the philosopher strays from Christian doctrine. Having admitted that the Trinity, the Incarnation, the Redemption, and the Last Judgment cannot be proved by reason, he proceeds on all other points to accept reason with a fullness and readiness that shocked the followers of Augustine. He was a mystic insofar as he acknowledged the supra-rationality of certain Christian dogmas and shared the mystic longing for union with God. But he was an intellectualist in the sense that he preferred the intellect to the heart as an organ for arriving at truth. He saw that Europe was bound for an age of reason, and he thought that a Christian philosopher should meet the new mood on its own ground. He prefaced his reasonings with scriptural and patristic authorities, but he said with pithy candor, locus ab auctoritate est infirmissimus. The argument from authority is the weakest. The study of philosophy, he wrote, does not aim merely to find out what others have thought, but what the truth of the matter is. His writings rival those of Aristotle in the sustained effort of their logic. Seldom in history has one mind reduced so large an area of thought to order and clarity. We find no fascination in Thomas's style. It is simple and direct, concise and precise, with not a word of padding or flourish. But we miss in it the vigor, imagination, passion, and poetry of Augustine. Thomas thought it out of place to be brilliant in philosophy, when he wished he could equal the poets at their own game. The most perfect works of his pen are the hymns and prayers that he composed for the feast of Corpus Christi. Among them is the stately sequence Lauda Sion Salvatorum, which preaches the real presence in sonorous verse. In the Lauds is a hymn beginning with a line from Ambrose, Verbum supernum prodiens, and ending with 2 stanzas, O salutaris hostia, regularly sung at the benediction of the sacrament. And in the Vespers is one of the great hymns of all time, a moving mixture of theology and poetry. Sing, O tongue, the mystery of the body glorious, and of blood beyond all price, which, in ransom of the world, fruit of womb most bountiful, all the people's King poured forth. Given to us and born for us from an untouched maid, and sojourning on the planet, spreading seed of word made flesh, as a dweller with us lowly, wondrously he closed his stay. In the night of the Last Supper, with apostles while reclining, all the ancient law observing in the food by law prescribed, food he gives to 12 assembled, gives himself with his own hands. Word made flesh converts true bread with a word into his flesh. Wine becomes the blood of Christ, and if sense should fail to see, let the pure in heart be strengthened by an act of faith alone. Therefore such great sacrament venerate we on our knees. Let the ancient liturgy yield its place to this new rite. Let our faith redeem the failure of our darkened sense. To begetter and begotten, praise and joyful song, salutation, honor, power, blessings manifold. And to him from both proceeding, let our equal praise be told. Thomas wrote almost as much as Albert, in a life little more than half as long. He composed commentaries on the sentences of Peter Lombard, on the Gospels, Isaiah, Job, Paul, on Plato's Timaeus, on Boethius and Pseudo-Dionysius, on Aristotle's Organon, of heaven and earth, of generation and corruption, meteorology, physics, metaphysics, on the soul, politics, ethics, Questiones Disputatae, on truth, on power, on evil, on the mind, on virtues, etc. Quod libita, discussing points raised at random in university sessions. Treatises on the principles of nature, on being and essence, on the rule of princes, on the occult operations of nature, on the unity of the intellect, etc. A 4-volume Summa de Veritate Catholicae Fidei contra Gentiles, from 1258 to 1260. A 20-volume Summa Theologica, from 1267 to 1273, and a Compendium Theologiae, from 1271 to 1273. Thomas's published writings fill 10,000 double-column folio pages. The Summa contra Gentiles, or Summary of the Catholic Faith against the Pagans, was prepared at the urging of Raymond of Peñafort, general of the Dominican order, to aid in the conversion of Moslems and Jews in Spain. Therefore Thomas in this work argues almost entirely from reason, though remarking sadly that this is deficient in the things of God. He abandons here the scholastic method of disputation, and presents his material in almost modern style, occasionally with more acerbity than befitted him whom posterity would call Doctor Angelicus and Seraphicus. Christianity must be divine, he thinks, because it conquered Rome and Europe despite its unwelcome preaching against the pleasures of the world and the flesh. Islam conquered by preaching pleasure and by force of arms. In Part 4 he frankly admits that the cardinal dogmas of Christianity cannot be proved by reason, and require faith in the divine revelation of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. Thomas's most extensive work, the Summa Theologica, is addressed to Christians. It is an attempt to expound and to defend, from Scripture, the Fathers, and reason, the whole body of Catholic doctrine in philosophy and theology. We shall try, says the prologue, to follow the things that pertain to sacred doctrine with such brevity and lucidity as the subject matter allows. We may smile at this 21-volume brevity, but it is there. This Summa is immense, but not verbose. Its size is merely the result of its scope, for within this treatise on theology are full treatises on metaphysics, psychology, ethics, and law, 38 treatises, 631 questions or topics, 10,000 objections or replies. The orderliness of argument within each question is admirable, but the structure of the Summa has received more praise than its due. It cannot compare with the Euclidean organization of Spinoza's Ethics, or the concatenation of Spencer's Synthetic Philosophy. The treatise on psychology, Part 1, questions 75 to 94, is introduced between a discussion of the 6 days of creation and a study of man in the state of original innocence. The form is more interesting than the structure. Essentially, it continues and perfects the method of Abélard as developed by Peter Lombard. Statement of the question, arguments for the negative, objections to the affirmative, arguments for the affirmative from the Bible, from the Fathers, and from reason, and answers to objections. The method occasionally wastes time by putting up a straw man to beat down, but in many cases the debate is vital and real. It is a mark of Thomas that he states the case against his own view with startling candor and force. In this way, the Summa is a summary of heresy, as well as a monument of dogma, and might be used as an arsenal of doubt. We may not always be satisfied with the answers, but we can never complain that the devil has had an incompetent advocate. 6. The Thomist Philosophy. 1. Logic. What is knowledge? Is it a divine light infused into man by God, without which it would be impossible? Thomas parts company at the very outset from Augustine, the mystics, the intuitionists. Knowledge is a natural product derived from the external corporeal senses and the internal sense called consciousness of the self. It is an extremely limited knowledge, for up to our time no scientist yet knows the essence of a fly. But within its limits knowledge is trustworthy, and we need not fret over the possibility that the external world is a delusion. Thomas accepts the scholastic definition of truth as adequatio rei et intellectus, the equivalence of the thought with the thing. Since the intellect draws all its natural knowledge from the senses, its direct knowledge of things outside itself is limited to bodies, to the sensible or sensory world. It cannot directly know the supersensible, metaphysical world, the minds within bodies, or God and his creation, but it may by analogy derive from sense experience an indirect knowledge of other minds, and likewise of God. Of a third realm, the supernatural, the world in which God lives, the mind of man can have no knowledge except through divine revelation. We may by natural understanding know that God exists and is one, because his existence and unity shine forth in the wonders and organization of the world. But we cannot by unaided intellect know his essence or the Trinity. Even the knowledge of the angels is limited, for else they would be God. The very limitations of knowledge indicate the existence of a supernatural world. This book is continued on Cassette 9, Side 1.